Responsibility is my theme for this morning. Well, the first part of this morning. And then later on I'm going to move on to values and ethics, which are also obviously closely connected with responsibility. Okay, well, perhaps I could start off by talking a little bit about the metaphysical beliefs which influence people often when talking about responsibility, because I suppose overall I want to put a case for responsibility being an experience that we need to work with as an experience without allowing our view of it to be structured by metaphysical beliefs, which I think it commonly is. And one way in which I could perhaps help to show how it commonly is by relating this to cognitive biases as well. So the two extremes of view about responsibility are created by the free will view and the determinism view, or associated with them, I should say. So, in this case, what I take free will to be is the belief that we could choose to do anything of which we are capable. That there's something in us which has complete choice, could, in some sense, act as it wished at any point. So the free will belief tends to ignore the complexity of the psychological processes involved whenever we do make a choice and the influences on our choices. Determinism, on the other hand, is the view that all events are predictable. But particularly here, we're looking at its impact on human choice. So if we believe that all human choices are predictable, then that means there are no choices. In effect, it means that we are governed by laws beyond ourselves. Now, the implications of both of these views for responsibility are the extremes, extreme metaphysical views. So free will is associated with a label I've adopted here is the total responsibility fallacy, which is perhaps a bit of a mouthful, but do you want to call it the TRF or something then? And then the determinist approach tends to lead to the zero responsibility fallacy. And now, on the one hand, these are views that people may put forward as ideologies, or whether it's in a religious or philosophical or scientific context or political context, they may use these views and promote them. But very often, I think, where people do hold these views, they are by no means consistently recognised in people's actions and thoughts. So people who believe that they are totally responsible for everything they do rarely actually take responsibility for everything they do, if ever. If that's even possible. And people who believe they're not responsible for anything they do actually do tend to acknowledge responsibility, at least for some things. And of course there is a move which determinists very generally do tend to make, which is to say that responsibility is a social construction or a social convention. So they might, for example, tend to reduce moral responsibility to legal or social responsibility. So just as a set of expectations that society has of people, or even those which are written down in law. But if you do that, the question then remains, how far are you really responsible for those things? The determinist has great difficulty, for example, I think, with a question like, supposing you lived in Nazi Germany, that the social conventions and expectations around you were those of Nazism, for the most part. What will be your responsibility there? And of course from that follows what will be your ethical, the right ethical thing to do. Now, yes, perhaps if I could then trace that in relation to a few cognitive biases, because I think the cognitive biases that have been identified to do with this show that actually we all sometimes fall into total responsibility fallacy or zero responsibility fallacy. We're pretty much all of us are inconsistent in this regard. These are kind of excuse positions. They're ways of not actually recognising responsibility in our experience, of oversimplifying our experience in relation to responsibility, and creating, using an over-dominant left hemisphere rigid thinking, creating a picture where we are responsible where it suits us and not where it doesn't, basically. Some examples of cognitive biases relevant to this. So one good one to start with is the illusion of control. And this particularly relates to oneself. So I'm likely to have the illusion of control as regards what I control rather than what other people control. And it consists in the idea that when I'm doing something, I have control over it, basically. So the assumption that I have control even when there are perhaps good reasons to think that my control is limited or dependent on a lot of other conditions. I mean, quite a nice example of this, I think, is driving, that people have all kinds of hang-ups about driving. But when people are themselves driving, they tend to overestimate the amount of control they have over the vehicle. And comparing that with if they're a passenger and somebody else is driving, they're likely to underestimate the amount of control the other person has over the vehicle. And I've definitely experienced that myself. When I'm a passenger with my wife driving, I tend to worry, is she going to spot that red light, or, is she going to do this or do that? And so this is obviously the backseat driving. You could call this the backseat driving syndrome, couldn't you? That we sort of want to have that control because we feel in control even when actually we're not that in control. And I suppose it goes even further with the inebriated person who's quite sure that they're in control and actually they've got less control than usual. You could also, however, compare this to the attribution error. Now, there are two forms of this in the terms that psychologists use, and I'm not quite sure why they use these tags, but they call it the fundamental or the ultimate attribution error. So that's just really so you can identify if you look it up in the literature, but I don't see how those titles are really helpful. But anyway, what they call let's call it the attribution error, is the flip side of that. So we tend to overestimate our own degree of control over things, but when somebody else makes a mistake, so for example when somebody else has an accident, we tend to think that they're to blame. So if it's something good, we tend to overestimate our degree of control over it. If it's something bad, then we're more likely to opportunistically overestimate other people's degree of responsibility for their misdeed. Obviously, we do this with criminals as well. Particularly if you feel strongly about a crime that's been committed, maybe against you, you're much more likely to blame the person rather than say, oh, well, they were brought up in terrible circumstances and they have all these excuses for behaving in that way.
There was a Colombian footballer about 20 odd years ago who made a mistake in a World Cup final and he was murdered.
Good.
He scored 9 goals. Mm-hmm.
That's I've never heard that example. That's pretty extreme, isn't it? Okay. And then some other ones. But there are also occasions, it's not just that we overestimate our own degree of control sometimes. There are also occasions when we try and duck our own responsibility for our own actions. So there's the actor-observer bias, which is, again, really about bringing different judgments to bear on actor and observer, whether you're doing it or not. And the classic case of this is where you yourself have been involved in an accident. And, of course, you focus on the surrounding circumstances and the conditions that made you have an accident. So wasn't really your fault. It doesn't feel like it's your fault. That suddenly, apparently in insurance reports, the word "suddenly" comes up a great deal. Suddenly, there was a lamppost in front of me, and again, I can relate that to that through experience, because there's only been one real major accident in my driving career, and that was when I hit a sheep on a moor in Cumbria, and I went over. There was a dip in the road and what you call it, a height in the road, a steep bit where it goes up and then down again. Yeah, blind summit. That's the word. Yeah. So I went over a blind summit, and suddenly there was a sheep in front of me, and so of course, but obviously when you think about it, you can't really blame the sheep very much, at least.
Was it hit my fist with his face, my lord?
Yes, indeed. Okay, so I think we're all prone to this to moving to the deterministic mode when it suits us, and we can also do this with other people. So we can also assume that other people are determined again when it suits us. So another interesting phenomenon is social loafing, and this is very evident when people work in teams, and if you feel that other people are going to do what's necessary anyway, then you contribute a bit less, and this has been measured by psychologists, for example in tugs of war. So if you're in a tug of war in one team pulling, and you feel there are enough strong people already doing it, so you don't need to pull that hard, really. And so you can find probably lots of examples of that. I mean, in business they talk about people pulling their weight in teams and things, don't they? And so there is a respect in which teams actually may discourage people from pulling their weight, as it were. Okay, so it's not just a question of these villainous libertarians who believe in free will and those who believe in determinism getting it all wrong, because we all do this sometimes, I think. But at the same time, I think the philosophical positions and the arguments made for them are, on the whole, unhelpful. They can have the effect of reinforcing our tendencies to fall back on these positions. So I want to then just focus a bit on the experience of responsibility rather than just the extremes that we're avoiding. And to do that, perhaps a good way of explaining this would be to use this graph. At least I hope this might be a comprehensible way of explaining it. So we can think of responsibility as it's something we feel. We may feel it because of to some degree because of social pressures and conventions and expectations, but also we have internalised those things, and we may have genuine reflections about responsibility which also input into our sense of responsibility. But I'm going to suggest that experience of responsibility is always incremental, so it's always a more or less matter. So if we're going to avoid the fallacies of the libertarians and the determinists, the total and zero responsibility fallacies, we're going to have to dwell in the middle, in the messiness of the middle. But within that middle, there's obviously quite a range of experiences of the degree of responsibility we have for things. So this rough graph more or less shows how this might work. So the axis here just shows a level of responsibility from 0 to total. But as you'll see, the black line doesn't ever quite reach either of those. So my suggestion is that in experience, there's always a degree of responsibility, whether it's 99.999% or whether it's 0.0001%, rather than there ever being total responsibility. Because once you get into that total or zero realm, you're in metaphysics, you're going in something beyond experience, beyond the experience of responsibility, which might actually lead us to be responsible. So that's one axis of the graph, but the other is to do with the factors that might affect our degree of responsibility in experience. And I'd suggest that there are broadly three of these. I mean, there may be more, but these are certainly three that I can identify. So three kinds of factors that may influence our the degree of responsibility we feel, the degree of responsibility we experience. So one is the relevance to experience. So one simple example, I feel quite responsible for this retreat. Right? Why is that? Well, because I'm in it. It's very relevant to my experience. I'm less responsible for the moment for my daughter who is away on a retreat, on a family retreat, although in broad sense I'm still responsible for it in some ways. And I'm much even less responsible for something which is very much on the boundaries of my experience or things that might be relevant to my experience. So yeah, there may be, probably is at some point, at the moment, a child starving in Somalia, say. Now, I wouldn't say that I've got absolutely no responsibility for that happening, but it's got much less relevance to my experience, which certainly reduces that responsibility. And obviously it will help if a large number of people took more responsibility for children starving in Somalia. Even if we all took very little responsibility as individuals, that would still add up, and more responsibility would be taken on the whole. The problem with such issues is people assuming either zero or total responsibility, and the total responsibility tends to rebound in that people find it impossible to actually sustain or to realistically act on. So in effect it can turn into zero.
About social loafing as well. You think it's someone else's problem?
Indeed, yeah, absolutely. So that's one factor that might affect our experience. Another is degree of integration. So here I think there's you can relate responsibility to issues like awareness and general understanding of conditions and avoidance of blockages to that appreciation of conditions. So the more we appreciate what's going on and try to address it, as we can do if we're generally more integrated, the more we're likely to take responsibility for what's going on. So I'd suggest that just feeds into our experience of responsibility. It's not the only factor. So you can't say that somebody who's really integrated has vast responsibility for the world, but maybe they have a bit more than they would if they weren't. And I think you can see this in society in straightforward ways. So parents have generally a lot more integration in the sense of connections between their different bits of understanding of the conditions around them than young children do. Therefore, it's the parents who are responsible for the young children rather than the other way around. So you can relate this to other factors that are widely recognised socially. And then the other factor that feeds into this, I think, is justification, which we were talking about yesterday. So the question of, how well do we understand what's going on around us? How well do we understand other people's needs, for example, or dangers that are threatening us, or anything of that kind? Obviously, we can't be certain about any of it. So in order to take responsibility for it, we need some understanding of it. We need to, but we have to base our assessments and our choices, our judgments based on a sense of responsibility, on our understanding of what's going on up to this point, as far as we can justify our understanding of things. So it needs to be based on our provisional beliefs, in other words. So obviously that creates a complex mixture. I'm not suggesting that we try and turn these into some sort of complex calculation or anything. I'm just suggesting that these feed into our experience of being responsible. And so the sort of line that we'd end up if we try and track these two things against each other. So what leads to our sense of responsibility and responsibility itself would look something like this. There are some things for which we're more responsible in experience and other things which we're less responsible for in experience, but we're never totally responsible for anything, nor are we completely non-responsible for anything. And just a few examples I thought I'd try and put, in a very vague fashion, but just to suggest some places on that line where we might put certain things that we might feel responsible for. So, offspring, particularly in the sense of young children who are one son or daughter, I would obviously come pretty high on that line. But at the same time, perhaps if you asked many people, they put it here, you've got total responsibility for your 2-year-old or whatever. I don't think we can have total responsibility even for maybe even for a baby in some cases. There were ways we were held responsible by society. There were legal restrictions and so on. If you neglect your child, you might be prosecuted or whatever. People expect you to take responsibility, but that's a different thing from that experience of responsibility. So, at the same time as taking a lot of responsibility, I think we need to appreciate that there are things we can't actually control still, even about, so if a 2-year-old wanders off and has an accident, that may not be our fault in much, to a great extent.
Cop deaths generally.
Indeed, even things like that, yeah. Yep. Indeed, so even a baby may get an illness that's got nothing much to do with our actions. And then thinking of illnesses that we may have, well, obviously they could slide or go down that line depending on what illness we're talking about, and probably, Ebola might go somewhere down here somewhere. You really can't help getting an infectious disease. Maybe with lung cancer, you might want to slide it up here a little bit. If you how far people are responsible for their own illnesses in some cases. But it's obviously a good example of something that's ambiguously in the middle. We don't want to either say we have no responsibility for this, we shouldn't bother looking after ourselves, in effect, or on the other hand, that we're totally responsible and shouldn't regard ourselves as lucky or unlucky or whatever, or subject to conditions. And then, with some sort of major shared ethical issue, so like global warming or political issue, I would suggest that we recognise as individuals we have a pretty low level of responsibility. At the same time, that's no reason to not contribute to responsible responses to it. So that's where I think it becomes very important not to think in terms of zero responsibility, even though the line may be coming down towards zero.
So in case of total responsibility, in the example of, do you want a cup of tea or coffee, are you not totally responsible for the decision that's made then?
Well, I wouldn't suggest that, no. I mean, there's a lot of conditions at work there, aren't there?
Right, well,
I wouldn't be interested in tea or coffee if I hadn't been brought up in a culture that regularly involved drinking those particular beverages.
right.
The fact of their availability and the person offering it having that wish and
so it's responsible, but it is not felt responsibility. I feel responsible for making that choice.
That's something else I want to clarify a bit. Yeah, so let me go on to that. So we could talk about that distinction between feeling responsible and being responsible, or perhaps being held responsible, or taking responsibility. So we could look at these two things. I think they're in a dialectic in some way, so they interact with each other. They're obviously not isolated from each other. So if you feel responsible, that's not going to be completely disconnected from your actions and indeed the social environment. You're going to, a lot of the time we feel responsible because of those social expectations, the sense that we will be held responsible, for example. But there are some occasions when our feeling of responsibility may, go beyond that, or it may, for example, we may reflect on an issue and consider it far more important than the other people around us do, and decide to take an initiative about it, and that involves feeling responsibility to a greater extent than you would expect from that. Or there may be something where we have to take responsibility, where we feel that's overestimated by society. So I feel that, say, with the way teachers are tweeted about exam results, that they're expected to take responsibility for them to a much greater extent than they can actually be responsible for them. So that's a dialectic, but there's also another dialectic here between can and ought. So if you ought to act in a certain way, traditionally in philosophy that implies that you can do it. But at the same time, I think that ought can't really be far in advance of can. And one of the mistake of the total responsibility fallacy is to assume that we ought to do things which really, in practice, if you really look at the conditions, go way, way ahead of can. Take Jesus' instruction to the young man who came to him saying, what should I do? How should I live? And he said, you should sell all your goods and give them to the poor. So that's a pretty big instruction, isn't it? It's a pretty big demand. And but a lot of people's understanding of ethics works in that way, that it consists of an absolute instruction of some kind, which is way, way beyond, obviously, it's something that we could physically do, perhaps, but psychologically, it's way beyond what the conditions would allow us to do. It takes no account of the different, perhaps just the connections that we've made in our brains, the limitations of the different channels in which our decision-making processes could run. So the chances of one of us at this moment deciding to walk out and sell all our goods and give them to the poor, I'm not saying it's zero, but it's astonishingly low. And that will be the case for almost anybody in society. And there are good reasons for that. So it's not this total unrealistic pie in the sky ethics is a result of absolutization and metaphysics, of not basing ethics on our appreciation of conditions. So what I'm suggesting is that ought needs to be slightly in advance of can. Now, I'm not going to offer a precise formula for how you can decide what you ought to do, because that's something we only encounter in experience. But it doesn't. That way of putting it doesn't mean that there isn't an ought. That if we feel a responsibility, then we feel an ought as well as a can, and we can encounter that ought. We can encounter that ought particularly because there are situations we can imagine, and there are cognitive models we could use which go slightly beyond the one we're using at the moment. So the particular representation of the situation we have at the moment is limited, and there are other ones we could have, with which we may be slightly or vaguely aware, and that we could move into with a little bit of effort. Not too much, but a little bit. This perhaps gets to the heart of the issue with ethics and the middle way. I think that the middle way requires us to find realistic ways forward, but at the same time to take ethics seriously. But I think if you fall back on the zero or the total responsibility fallacies, then that really militates against taking ethics seriously. So if you think of ethics in terms of a total responsibility, to solve global warming, for example, or to completely make sure that your child has a happy upbringing and a happy adult life, you can't do this. So either you subject yourself to an unrealistic amount of stress in the attempt to do that and then fail and are deeply disappointed in the process, or at some point you give up and maybe you sink back into the zero responsibility fallacy and throw up your arms. Oh, I can't do anything. Go off and make a mess of your life. That's. Whereas if we'd found that balance during that whole process, we could make a difference.
But people often do feel 100% responsibility. I mean, people feel they have free will. And when you say tea or coffee, you feel you have made that decision 100%, don't you? I mean, you can reflect on it and think, well, maybe it's cultural, maybe it's something in my childhood, maybe it's conditioning or whatever. But you do feel 100% responsible?
Well, depends what you mean by feel, I think, isn't it? We've got an idea of that responsibility. And I think that idea, that idea is basically metaphysical, so it comes from a group expectation of some kind, rather than something we have gained from a wider experience or an embodied experience of what responsibility consists in.
But is embodied, is it not embodied, that feeling of free will?
Well, yeah, I think in some ways it can be. You can, if what you mean by a feeling of free will is a feeling of responsibility, yes. But I don't think feeling it to be total is something we can base on our bodies, given that our bodies are limited by nature.
But if you feel hungry, you then feel 100% responsible for opening the thing and eating a cake, don't you? Even though you're not, and it's all conditioned, but you feel it in a bodily sense.
Well, I think we just need to try and disentangle that by thinking about, well, what are the factors that are working in tension there? So you've got, there may be two voices at work there, for example, when you feel hungry and you want food, but perhaps you also feel guilty about eating certain kinds of food. And so there are two voices at work there, and they're in tension with each other. And it's that fact that there are two voices, which is that experience of stretch, that experience of being responsible and being able to do something slightly different from what you may be doing.
But that's all kind of almost pre-conscious, isn't it, these two voices?
Well, it may be pre-conscious at the moment. It may or may not be conscious at the moment, but it may just be something you could be conscious of. Or,
yeah. Well, that's what I would kind of think. If you're mindful, you kind of bring that pre-conscious decision into the fore, and this sort of mindfulness is kind of useful in avoiding this free will absolutism.
Absolutely, yeah. Slip into the language there, but that's why I suggested that integration is one of the things that can bump up slightly our experience of responsibility, and mindfulness would be, a temporary form of integration. So at the moment we're a bit more integrated than we usually are, and thus experience a bit more responsibility
or less responsibility
where appropriate. Yes, if it's a zero.
You feel actually, I'm not responsible.
Yeah. So you can avoid that idea of the zero responsibility. Yeah. So it constantly brings you back to that messy estimation of just that you're a bit responsible. Yeah. So just to close this again with my usual remarks about practice to try and make sure that it's linked into practices that we could take away from this. Just a few simple points really. That one is that it's not wrong to fall short of what may be our long-term moral goals. So supposing, say, you decide to be or to become a vegetarian or a vegan, it's then easier to slip into the total responsibility fallacy. To think, well, okay, it's my responsibility, if you then decide it's my responsibility to be vegetarian. And if you then fail to do that, it may seem as though you've shattered that responsibility in a sense, so you might slip back into the zero position. But I think if we think of these kinds of commitments incrementally enough, then, or with enough necessary impurity, then we can come to terms with our own failures to some extent. We can work in a realistic way towards such goals. So if you're deeply used to bacon sandwiches and you decide to become a vegetarian, you need some kind of step-by-step plan. In other words, an incremental way of changing, and also a way of being kind to yourself if you fail in your goals, whatever those goals are. So it's not wrong to fall short in those circumstances. It's part of the recognition of what rightness would consist in. And then also, we don't need to feel socially responsible for everything we're held responsible for. And I think I've already made that point in a way and I think that particularly applies to people who are often held responsible in excessive ways. So social workers very much strike me as in that category. Teachers and parents, and the pressures on parents to take total responsibility for what happens to their children seem to be increasing, if anything, in today's society.
Benefits.
Yeah, people on benefits is another example. Yep.
Council workers.
Yeah.
Not mentioning anyone.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it applies to any profession to some degree. And also, just a final point, that there are these endless demands these days, I think, on our time or money or attention. Charity appeals, for example. In some sort of ideal way, we might think, it will be great to be able to give money to all these charity appeals. But this is just not psychologically sustainable. So I think that if we think of this ideal as being the good in some way, and that if we're not doing it, then we're somehow not as good as we ought to be, I suggest that's a mistake, really, that what's good is adopting a sustainable response to these things. So my own strategy with this is to decide what charities I'm going to give to, take outstanding orders, and ignore all the rest, bin them, which is hard-hearted in a sense, that you've got to throw away these plangent appeals to your heart. But that seems to me the best strategy. Maybe other people can suggest other ones, but that's it's an attempt to create a sustainable response to it. Anyway, I'll leave it there. So any thoughts or questions on responsibility, on these ideas?
What was your feeling about social or corporate responsibility, so work rather than just an individual person?
Well, it's a slightly different ballgame, isn't it? Because overwhelmingly, social corporate responsibility is legally regulated, isn't it? But at the same time, I think that groups, whatever they are, reflect the individual position here, in that, for example, they can be more or less integrated. So the group could be, there's a whole set of issues here as to what integration means for a group. But it can mean the people in the group are in harmony with each other, basically. But it can also mean that they're in harmony with the rest of society. So I think, and in the conditions around them. So I think if something like a corporation is taking as much responsibility as it might, it needs to be as integrated as possible, which means it takes more responsibility. It's pushing itself up that scale, if you like. And it can make that realistic by having better communications within itself and better communications with the world around it, and taking account of more of the conditions in the world around it. So things like corporations shutting off environmental responsibility, for example, is an obvious example of something that's likely to cause conflict in the long run, or cause you're going to repress awareness of these negative effects, say, perhaps of the environmental policy of a company, and thus that's working against integration, and it's going to move us down the scale to less responsibility. And certainly to be avoided is the tendencies that some corporations have to basically adopt zero responsibility as the norm, except when they're legally required to have it, and then you suddenly go up to total responsibility within the very limited framework of legal or possibly social pressure in some cases, or political pressure. But we need a gradation here rather than a sudden bar chart rise. Does that answer the question you're thinking of? Yeah. There's a lot of stuff here. I'll talk more about groups actually tomorrow, and so this will relate to that, and that also relates to the question of political application of this.
There's been I don't know if you're aware, there's been an interesting development in the last couple of years in the British penal system, which tends to have quite a free will view of the idea of responsibility when you commit a crime. I think Ken Clark's left now, but what's interesting, they've been making moves to more of a restorative model, and it's interesting. It's come from a conservative government, which tends to have these more of these views about free will, but it's based on economics in a sense, because they've looked at this Scandinavian model where there's arguably a more integrative understanding of responsibility. They tend to take more conditioning more into account, and it's not just about, there's a sort of a balance there. And through that process in the Scandinavian countries, reoffending is a lot less, especially, when you get victims and perpetrators together and do some of these sort of initiatives. So, and so the government here says, well, this seems to make sense because then you're going to get less people in prison. So I just thought that was a...
And that's cause and effect, isn't it?
I think you might just be giving them a bit too much credit there. I think that basically they just don't want to keep spending the amount of money on the numbers in prison, do they? And so they just want to do any way to sort of keep them out of prison.
Yeah, but, well, I'm saying that's the main reason, arguably the main reason why. I think actually, as a conservative politician, Ken Clarke is on...
He's the left of the party,
yeah. But I think why the party itself bought this idea, or is buying this idea, because it's cheaper. Yeah.
It works.
And it worked,
yeah.
They're all pragmatic at the end of the day, aren't they?
Yeah, that's true.
None of them are going to die for their principles, are they?
That's quite fortunate, in fact, isn't it? They get tied for their principles. But but it's just an illustration, I think, whether it's economic or not, because economic conditions are tied in with a lot of other conditions.
That's true.
If you stick to one particular strong ideological conception, in this case about responsibility, that's going to collide with other conditions in lots of ways, and eventually it may become unsustainable. I think that's even more the case in the US, where they have this vast prison population. A lot of them drug offenders who would be best treated not in prison at all, but somewhere else.
There seems to me to be a lot of variation in the degree to which, I don't know whether it's government or society in a bigger scale takes over illness. It's like, on a sort of very basic level, most people, if they say go to a GP with an illness, then most things they're not considered responsible for until you get to the level where they're requiring support, particularly for any long length of time and particularly benefits, then they immediately fall into the category where they're almost assumed to be somehow responsible, possibly targeted by the media or whatever as being scroungers and all the useful things that you get. But what I've seen very little of in the midst of all of that is any attempt to take responsibility for the reasons that might be continuing to aggravate that person's illness and perhaps keep them in a cycle of illness, including a lot of the stress that is put on them by all of that. But even more so, a lack of responsibility to look at sort of systems and lifestyles and things, and where there could be more overall responsibility taken for how people get sick in the first place. And it seems that people switch from these different positions depending where they are in amongst all of that, and often with probably a significant degree of hypocrisy, really, if they actually, were to sit down and consider, which probably people very rarely do, that all these different conflicting ideas that they have about where someone is responsible, where the state is responsible.
I understand exactly what you're saying. The other side of that, if I can just sort of play devil's advocate, is this kind of idea of learned helplessness, where the government take too much responsibility, then people take even less responsibility for themselves. So there again, there has to be a balance.
A seminal moment in my relationship with my own health was in my late 20s, early 30s, when I was going for a job within the teaching organisation I belonged to. I needed a medical to go to this particular country, and I was in the Gulf at the time, and the medical doctor was from an Asian community, and I was just basically ticking boxes for my health, and he says, "Is there anything particular that you suffer from?" And I said, "Well, not really." I said, but I suffer quite regularly from piles. And he just said to me, well, what are you going to do about it then? And in a jokey way, he had a smile on his face. And I'd never been really posed that question before about my health. And I've not suffered from piles since. Because he explained that, prevention's better than cure. It's something that I can easily tackle with my diet and my.
How occurred to you before?
Not really. No, I just assumed doctors sorted you out.
Going back to your point, Martin, about the learned helplessness, that's actually in a way part of what I was referring to, because thinking of, I've met a number of people who've got long-term illnesses that aren't technically curable, and they're very creative, have been quite ambitious people, would really love to not be dependent, would love to be able to do a certain amount and be free of having to be supported by others. But they're actually prevented from even doing a small amount because so they end up in this situation where they don't want to be helpless, but they are made helpless because you either get everything or nothing. And it's very frustrating. And if those people just had a little bit of support to enable them to do what they can, they could probably manage to contribute enough to their own lives to sort of be more self-sufficient. But because it's easier, I guess, for the system, it's probably, I don't know whether it is cheaper, but it is probably certainly easier to think of people, so categorise them as one thing or another, and either fund them or not fund them. And so that's that was sort of an example of what I was including in what I was talking about.
Because there's a similar potential issue in aid, isn't there? Foreign aid, that there's a disaster and aid gets very closely focused on the victims of that disaster, and they get sort of total help in that context for a short period of time, and then there were lots of other people suffering from slightly less severe circumstances all over the place that could really do with a little bit of help, but perhaps they don't get it because.
But it's also the case that the help actually can undermine the people getting back on their feet to some degree.
Yeah, so there's all that case about aid, and that's one of the things that undermines the effectiveness of aid as well, isn't it? That in effect people may get this learned dependency on aid. Yeah,
hand ups, not hand pipes.
Yeah. But on the other hand, there is also some recognition of this, and I think particularly say Oxfam's policies, they're certainly a slogan is help people to help themselves, and there's some awareness around of the need for incrementality in one's responses to these things.
One more thing, sorry, I forgot to say about the illnesses as well. For example, the dependence on research is largely dependent on pharmaceutical companies, because they have a vested interest to do the research, because they're hoping to produce a product they can then market and make loads of money from. So again, there are a lot of illnesses that are below their level of interest because they know it's not likely to be something that's going to be a money spinner. So there are certain things that lots of money goes into researching, and again, so people who've got a kind of less sexy, if you like, illness can be sort of perhaps to some degree have this projected onto them that they're somehow more responsible, because that's quite convenient. Whereas somebody who's, say, got cancer or something where there's a lot of research goes on and a lot of efforts to try and find cures and things that help, you rarely get people, apart from the instance you made with possibly lung cancer if someone's been a heavy smoker. There is this huge amount of hypocrisy and variation in sort of this whole area of illness and who's responsible for what, in terms of both how illnesses develop and how they're treated, and what treatments are available, and and how convenient or otherwise it is then for others who might have to input more resources.
Yeah.
Depending on where people are on that spectrum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is also time framed, isn't it? I mean, if you took the example of lung cancer and heavy smoking, it's no good somebody feeling very responsible for their lung cancer when they've already got it, in a sense, because by that time the conditions have kicked in. There's really nothing they can do to reverse the smoking they've done in the past. So there's that degree of responsibility will also move up and down with time. It's because it's a question of what you can do now rather than what you did in the past.
But then do you then sort of say to people, well, okay, from now it's time frame. If you have lung cancer, we will treat you. But in 10 years' time, if someone gets lung cancer, we will not treat you. Where you can take the opportunity to take responsibility now and not to smoke. And then, do you know what I mean?
Well, that would be a way of putting pressure on people, but there's
that's what I mean, or just making them take responsibility, because once they've got it, well, it's too late to say, well, you're responsible, because it's not productive. But if you make them take responsibility, and then give them the time to adapt to it.
But if you make them take responsibility, then surely you've got to take responsibility.
Yeah, but just like back to my little pile story. But I've got a friend, for example, who's got high blood pressure. And so he takes all these tablets for it, but he's not changed his diet. Still.
Well, that's a classic one. I mean, just recently I've had experience of the general management of diabetes, and the classic, you get evaluated, diagnosed with diabetes, and the first thing they want to do is put you on medication. And they don't tend to look at lifestyle or anything much. Later on, you might get offered to go on a course to learn a bit more about it, but medication is always the first resort, rather than to look at, first of all, well, what are you doing that could have contributed to this? And because I think particularly diabetes, there is a certain amount of information and evidence of sort of causative things. There's also a certain amount of where you're not responsible, because it could be, genetics and other things, and just age and various factors that you're not responsible for. But there's certainly a lot of things where you can take responsibility in keeping it under control without having to resort to medication. Yeah. But of course, once you're on medication, you tend to be on it for life. Yeah. And I get frustrated seeing that sort of attitude, because I think, well, surely it would be better to try and work more on educating people who might be vulnerable to try and support themselves as well as possible, to at least perhaps delay possible onset of diabetes, and also to look at, first and foremost, what we can do to sort your diet and lifestyle out that might support you in getting better, rather than immediately slap you on medications to manage your blood sugar without you having to learn anything necessarily about what is or isn't affecting you adversely. And that's just one example of, very specific illness, but I'm sure that pattern, is exhibited over all kinds of other.
Yeah, and it's a very difficult thing, though, isn't it? How much the government or society should take a role in that. So, for instance, everybody around this room and everybody probably listening would have heard of 5 a day, and that's the government's attempt to ensure that people are eating a certain amount of vegetables that will help them live a healthier lifestyle. But I mean, to what extent should they do that? Really, is a difficult question. And how much public money should they spend on doing that, and whatever else? So it is very there is a requirement. I think that there is an ethic behind that the government should be doing that and supporting people. But then there is that. But then it comes back to that free will, doesn't it? The responsibility of free choice and whatever as well. As long as you're well educated to that extent. So I think it is done to a certain extent, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and then you're back to the thing, some people don't want to take responsibility, even given all that information. They're not interested.
But that's where incentives come in, because it's not just a case of educating people, because it obviously doesn't always work. You have to then incentivize people to take responsibility. And say that example of smoking, the incentive would be that if you don't smoke, if you do smoke and get lung cancer, 10 years' time, we will not treat you, and that'll incentivise people. It's no point just educating them saying, lung cancer is caused by smoking and expect them to stop smoking. Then you have to incentivise people, I think.
But then should they have the choice to smoke or not smoke? I think they should be able to take that responsibility. Shouldn't necessarily but they try and educate by having the little pictures on the packets and whatever, and that sort of works a bit. Mm-hmm. But then it is still up to people to make a decision.
But psychologically, you will have more effect, I think, if you incentivise them rather than just educate.
But also, you would need to support that approach by actually offering some sort of help as to look at what those cigarettes mean to them. Why are they smoking? Because if that's to meet some psychological need for, whether it's their friends or, that cigarettes my sort of one friend or my bit of a break or my way to sort of take 5 minutes for myself. If you just say, otherwise you'd just be putting more pressure on them psychologically without providing any sort of help to actually resolve the conditions that cause them to take up smoking or perhaps continue smoking in the first place. So I think it's got to be a very sort of broad, broad-ranging approach.
But I think that makes the point really that, the neglected area particularly here, the positive incentives are great, but they'll only take you so far. But there's also this element of integration in helping people to take responsibility. So I think in the long run, things like illnesses, there's a psychological dimension where encouraging people, for example, to adopt practices like meditation, could very often help them with a really quite wide range of conditions, just in terms of taking responsibility for their lives.